World of Warcraft Season of Discovery is going to be introducing to us 3 new tanks. And it's also buffing some of the tanks we already have in World of Warcraft Classic. Specifically, that's talking about Paladin tanks. They finally have a taunt and a ton more AoE threat. So today I'm going to break down the changes to the tanks, what will most likely be the meta, how you're going to use the tanks in their different respective roles, because some of them are better for single target fights, some of them are better as AoE tanks, and some of them are better for melee bosses, or some of them might be even better for the caster bosses. This is going to make a huge change in how we go in and tackle the raids, and the new tanks are actually just incredibly fun. It still feels like that old classic feeling when you're going through the raids, but it also feels like something totally new. So with that being said, let's dive right into everything we need to know about tanking in Season of Discovery, at least for Phase 1. And really fast, some of the concerns a lot of people have generally whenever getting into WoW Classic are things like, will we have to choose to go Alliance or Horde? Specifically, will one of the factions be a little bit stronger, or will one of the races be absolutely stronger? Usually you would have to go a human if you're playing Alliance, and you would have to go an orc if you're playing Horde. And you don't have to worry about that at all anymore, because a Grand has come out on Twitter to let us know that the WoW team has looked into this and is going to make sure that we don't have to be pigeonholed into a specific race or class. So Horde are actually also going to get Blessing of Kings by level 25. This is something that was missing, and with the Alliance getting Wind Fury, a lot of people were worried that it was forcing everyone to go Alliance because you get Wind Fury and Paladins. As well, on top of that, you don't need to worry about your weapon skill, because we most likely will have items in game that will be giving us increases to weapon skill. So you won't have to be super forced to be playing a specific race. So get ready to play whatever you guys want. And just right off the back, your main tanking rune will always give you 6% crit reduction for any of the new tanks. This means all of them will be crit immune to bosses, which is usually 5.6%. And after all that information, we can finally dive into the guide. And the first thing you need to understand is that the rune system in WoW Classic is basically going to be things that you find out in the open world or in dungeons throughout these discoveries. There might even be puzzles for it, but when you find these items, they will be permanent enchantments that you can put on a certain slot of your gear. Things like an enchantment to your chest piece, your gloves, or your legs. At least those are the 3 we have so far at level 25. And these are the things that are going to completely change the way we experience WoW Classic. So looking at those specifically, let's start with the Warlock Tanks. And the first or major thing that Warlock Tanks are getting is Metamorphosis. You may have seen some of the streams where a giant demon was running around tanking everything. And this is going to be the main tank change. It completely revamps the class to be a tank. First of all, it gives you 500% extra armor. Then it reduces your chance to be critically hit by 6%. It increases your threat generation by 100% all of the time, just flat out. And your life tap will also give you 100% more mana. So it is a lot more efficient to be able to use life tap. You don't need to use it more often, which would sacrifice a lot of your HP. Now, this also changes your Searing Pain ability to be instant cast. So you can now instantly cast Searing Pain, which already causes a high amount of threat, doubling that from the earlier passive that we just talked about. Your Shadow Bolt spell is converted into a AoE cleave. This is going to be called Shadow Cleave, and this will be a melee attack that hits up to 3 nearby enemies with a 6-second cooldown. So you now have your own cleave, making it a lot easier for you to be one of those AoE tanks. Curse of Recklessness completely turns into a taunt. Now this will taunt your target to attack you for the next 3 seconds. It has a 10-second cooldown, but this is going to be your single target taunt ability, Curse of Recklessness. We also get Demon Charge, which is basically a charge ability out of combat, so you can charge forward into the fray and then cleave right away to grab a bit of initial threat, as well as hitting them with that instant Searing Pain. And lastly, Warlocks do get an AoE taunt. That's right, they get an AoE taunt that is gonna last for 6 seconds on all of the targets that will be taunted onto you. This is called Demonic Howl. This is all coming from literally 1 rune. So this 1 rune is going to be the most important thing if you want to Warlock tank that you have to get. Now we don't know exactly how you get this just yet, but it will be the most important one. So I'm pretty sure it's a pretty long quest line that you're going to need help from a group to actually get done, but you will have access to it before you enter the 25 raid. Now the other 2 runes that boost your tanking abilities are going to be Master Channeler in your chest piece. This is going to actually make it so your Drain Life spell is no longer a channeled spell. Drain Life will actually become a a dot, a 15-second dot on the target, and it will return to you 50% more healing than what it did originally. So each time it ticks for that damage, you get 50% more of that back to yourself as healing. It does have a 15-second CD, so it's amazing for bosses, but on trash, if things die really quickly, it won't be like the most efficient to put it on any of the mobs that are gonna die first. So you would put it on whatever would be the last target to be brought down, so you have a little bit of self-sustain and self-healing. Now you could also go with demonic tactics. We all know in Classic, one of the things we always focus on is actually doing more damage while tanking, and demonic tactics will actually give you 10% increased chance to crit for yourself and your pet with your melees and your spells. So this is actually just a really nice one, just a raw 10% extra chance to crit, but we'll probably come up with more of like an AoE build a little bit for Warlocks. Warlocks are gonna most likely be one of the tanks that can tank a lot of the trash. And your big mitigation CD and the third ability that we're getting for Warlocks to tank, it's going to be called Demonic Grace. This is a 6-second long buff on yourself that will increase your dodge chance by 30%. So it's basically a mini evasion, but it also increases yours and your pet's crit chance by 30%. This could be used at the beginning of a fight to make sure that you as a tank only take very little damage as everybody is getting positioned, as well as you can get a ton of snap threat by having that extra 30% crit chance. Now, as for tanking builds, we're probably going to see something a little bit like this, at least early on for sustainability. We might completely change things up actually, because we will eventually maybe try to go for more of a DPS build depending on how hard the raid bosses actually hit. Moving on to my favorite class in Classic, the Rogues. Rogue Tank is really fun and I got to try this out. It is an amazing single target tank that relies significantly on things like parry, dodge, and basically not getting hit, mostly by melee damage. So you don't have a ton of AoE, but you are going to be a very, very strong single target tank. And rogues are already, even in hardcore right now, doing things like tanking Patchwork or Vesuvius, as the rogue can have enough dodge to never be hit by a boss that should one-shot you. So this is just even increasing that with the ability to also increase your threat gen. So let's dive right in. Your first main tanking ability is going to be called Just a Flesh Wound. This is going to go into your chest slot and it is going to be a taunt. So rogues now have a taunt, of course, but on top of that, you take 20% reduced physical damage. This is, again, very important to know. This is physical damage while Blade Dance is active. And Blade Dance is going to be your new kind of like slice and dice, but instead of increasing your attack speed, it increases your parry chance. We'll get into that next. You also have a 6% chance less to get critically hit from melee attacks, and your threat gen is increased massively. It doesn't say 100% increased threat gen, but this is something that the other classes are getting 100% increased threat gen. Rogues are already able to pump, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Rogues are going to now be very viable as your single target tanks. And that next ability you're looking at, like I mentioned, is Blade Dance. This is going to be your new finisher that will actually, instead of something like Slice and Dice increasing your attack speed, it will increase your parry chance. So at 5 combo points, you have 30 seconds long of this buff that increases your parry chance by 10%. We also get the third thing in our glove slot, which is main gauche. Main gauche. It's a French word for attacking with your offhand, and that's what it does. It attacks with your offhand and again increases your parry chance by another 10% for 10 seconds. This is going to be very, very powerful to line it up, especially whenever you're anticipating a big attack from bosses, but you have so much parry chance that rogues really aren't generally taking too much damage. What you're doing is actually avoiding damage most of the time. You can pair this with things like Evasion or even Ghostly Strike, which will give you 15% more dodge chance for 7 seconds, although I would highly wager that the best tanking spec for rogues early on at level 25, because you only have 16 talent points to use, is going to be something looking like this. Getting a little bit extra dodge chance, raw dodge chance, but you do want to still be hitting more often, so improved Sinister Strike, I think, is going to be something that's very, very powerful. One thing you are missing massively at lower lower levels is hit chance. It is just like inherent. You have terrible hit chance. Anything you can get with hit, which some of the items from the raid do have hit percentage on them, is going to be huge. So getting precision is going to be a very large one, but then getting an extra raw 5% extra parry is really nice and free, because you also then get riposte, which is just going to do a ton of damage for very little energy. This is going to be a massive ability for you, and you'll probably even be able to disarm some of the bosses just knowing the way classic works. From there, you can choose whatever you get, but I think having a massively reduced CD of evasion is something that most people are going to opt for, because if you have a ton of incoming damage, or if you're tanking a ton of things at once, then you want to have a CD rolling. This will basically make you unkillable. Seriously, with evasion up and the other abilities all running at the same time, you're pretty much going to not be hit ever. So if you are healing a rogue tank, you're probably having a good time and going to be out there DPSing, but rogue tanks, again, don't have a crazy amount of AoE threat. And our last new tank is the Shaman. Shaman tanks are finally seeing their time in the limelight, because your first thing you're going to do is equip your chest with the Shield Mastery rune. This makes it so that each time you block, you regain 4% mana, and this is huge. So if you're not getting a hit by any melee attacks or mobs like that, then you are actually going to be completely On top of the mana regen, you gain a buff giving you 30% of your shield's armor value, stacking up to 5 times each time you block. And you also gain 10% increased chance to block and 50% increased value to your blocks. So you are a block tank, pretty reminiscent of Paladins, and that's actually where you're in the same realm, because now you will have incredible AoE threat as well as incredible single target threat. Maybe some of the best single target threat, to be brutally honest. It seems like it's impossible to rip off of a Shaman, and that's because of this next ability, which is called Way of Earth. And this is when you have Rockbiter enchanted on your weapon, then you will gain 100% extra threat at all times, just 100% extra threat. You also gain 30% free HP, as well as you take 10% reduced damage, and you have that 6% chance less to be crit. This will go into your leg slot, and it'll also turn your Earth Shock into a taunt, and that is where you are getting your crazy amounts of single target threat. It's from blasting things with Earth Shock. Earth Shock is now its unique own ability. It doesn't share the same CD as your other actual shocks, so you can throw Flame Shock out there, and you'll actually use that to have a dot that refreshes your AoE, Cone of Cold, and that Cone of Cold that does a ton of threat is going to be called Molten Blast. And this will blast all enemies in front of you for a little bit of fire damage, but it generates a high amount of threat. Also, those Flame Shock dots have a 10% chance to just instantly refresh the CD of this. So you are always going to want to be tossing out those Flame Shocks as often as you possibly can and trying to get more of these procs so that you can just basically continuously instant cast AoE taunt on everything in front of you. This is going to make Shamans like a phenomenal tank for dungeons. You will blast through dungeons so quickly. You will most likely have no issues with mana, because other than in raids, everything in Classic tends to melee you. So you're going to be blocking all the time, just getting that mana back, and you're just going to be continuously resetting this and just blasting the AoE threat. So Shaman tanks are going to be phenomenal for dungeons and AoE threat. Rogue tanks, amazing for single target boss encounters, and Warlock tanks, kind of a hybrid between the two. But the changes to Paladin tanks are pretty large as well, so let's briefly break them down. The biggest one is getting a taunt, and that's going to be in your glove slot. It's going to be called Hand of Reckoning. While you know this ability, the threat bonus from Righteous Fury is also increased by 80%, which is massive now, because any of your AoE threat is also increased by 80%. Consecration going down on the floor means you can just tank a ton of mobs at one time, and you are a block tank, so you're not too afraid of actually tanking so many things at once. This ability also solves all mana issues that Paladins have, which is notorious for Classic, because you actually gain back 25% mana for the amount that you're healed from other people. So whenever healers are just bombing into you, 25% of that healing will be returned to you as mana. You'll never go Additionally, you have a mini cheat death. Any attacks that would bring you below 35% HP are reduced by 20%. In the leg slot, traditionally, you would think Avenger's Shield will probably be the go-to, and it really might be. It gives you a ranged attack that hits pretty hard, and it's very similar to how Avenger's Shield works in other versions of the game, although it does not silence. Now, one of the things that's big here and big to note is that in the same slot, you could get something like Divine Sacrifice, so we might see Paladins run with DSAC actually instead instead, as the tanks, when you don't really need to run with Avenger Shield, you can actually have a lot more mitigation for your whole entire raid, but these are sharing the same slot, so you're going to have to choose. Most people will traditionally go with Avenger Shield. The meta, we will decide a little bit later. And the last slot for Paladin tanks is going to be Aegis. Aegis? Well, that's going into your chest, and it's increasing your block value by 30%. And melee and range attacks have a 10% chance of increasing your block by 30% for 10 seconds or for 5 blocks. So this is really nice. If you were getting hit by a lot of things, you were just consistently proccing this, your block is always going to be going off. So Paladins are your main AoE tanks right now, and it's looking very solid. You're also going to be doing a great job as a single target tank. Paladin tanks in Classic, rejoice, you're finally back. Now I would say from my perspective, warrior tanks get the shortest end of the stick because they are just absolutely OP already, but warriors might also be getting gladiator stance, a revamped version of D stance where you can do a lot more damage. And if this happens, you are going to be using a shield, as well as you're probably going to see menaces like Bajira out in PvP, just absolutely demolishing people. So if you're tanking as a warrior, the main new things you get, in particular, Devastate. Devastate will replace Sunder Armor, and it will hit for 100% of your melee weapons damage, and that damage will also be increased per application of Sunder on the boss. So you will be encouraged to get Sunders up. Devastate will hit harder, much quicker. You probably won't use Improved Expose because your warrior tanks will use Devastate, but you'll also most likely, again, in my opinion, be doing things like dual tanking and hitting for a ton of damage. Although we do get Furious Thunder, which increases the potency of Thunderclap, reducing the enemy's attack speed by an additional 6%. Past that, in the chest slot, everything that we have is mostly looking to increase your rage generation or increase your damage a little bit. And lastly, Druids, rejoice. Druid tanks are back as well, although they were actually completely viable. It's like the second and only other viable spec other than warriors, but Druids get some really cool things. One thing is literally a Wind Fury for your party called Wild Strikes. This goes into your chest piece, although you might have to miss out on something else for mitigation. This is really nice because it gives your entire party a Wind Fury, 20% chance to hit with an extra attack that will also do 20% more attack power on top of that attack. So having Wind Fury early is like so ridiculous, and you can't even get Wind Fury on a Shaman anyways by level 25. So this is how we get Wind Fury. Alliance finally gets Wind Fury. Wow. Survival of the Fittest is your other slot in the chest. This is going to be your damage reduction, and this is basically going to make it so that you have 6% chance less to get crit like everyone else, and you take 20% less damage while you're in any of your bear form. Although I would wager we'll probably see everybody wanting to have Wild Strikes and that Wind Fury in their group. If you don't have this, everyone's going to be kind of mad at you. So we'll see. It just all depends on how hard the last bosses hit. I do know a lot of people were wiping to a ton of the mechanics and bosses in the BFD raid already, and I know the other bosses are going to be significantly harder, but still I would say we'll most likely see people running with that Wind Fury. Now the legs slot, we didn't see anything that would massively boost you as a tank. The only thing you really get is Skull Bash, which is an interrupt, which is something that you're missing as a tank, but right now I think we're going to look for something else that's really going to be the meta in the leg slot. But then again, for your gloves, you have two options. We get Mangle and we get Lacerate. Lacerate is a ton of single target threat. This is going to be hitting with your main damage, but also it's going to give a bleed effect to the target, a stacking bleed effect that will make it so that they take more damage from the bleed, but as well as they take more damage from every subsequent Lacerate. So you can be spamming this to get a ton of threat on your single target, but as well as you can be tab hitting this on everything if you're doing some AoE tanking along with your swipe. Now, if you have classes that do bleed damage in your group, Mangle is going to be a very solid option for you. 160% normal damage, and it puts a debuff on the target for 1 minute that will increase all the damage it takes from bleeds by 30%. Now, if you have a rogue that's doing a bleed build, if you have warriors in your group, or even just feral druids, everyone likes to have the Mangle effect up. And other feral druids, I get feral druid DPS, which is going to look really, really good. It's going to be so much better than it was beforehand. But this is the last thing you have to really choose from, and that's a breakdown of literally all of the tanking specs in the new version Season of Discovery at level 25. These are all of the new things, the new runes that you can use and how you want to pair them up. I would wager that warrior tanks are still going to be insanely powerful, but at these lower levels, these runes are so good for some of the classes that you're probably going to see a lot of things like Shaman tanks, Warlock tanks. Rogue tank is going to be more of a niche situation in that single target situation. Rogues are also doing a ton of damage, so they're gonna look great. Paladin tanks are amazing right now, so you're all gonna be having a ton of fun. I will have more breakdowns and individual guides for every single class coming as soon as I can. Hopefully when my voice is back and when I finish moving. If you can't tell, things are very, very hectic here. Boxes everywhere. This is going to be a wild week. Thanks for watching, guys. I love you all. If you want to stay updated on everything Season of Discovery as well as Cataclysm Classic coming out, make sure to like and subscribe to the page. Or I guess like the video or comment, but just subscribe to the page. Whatever. Just do that. Thanks, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.